Well, in 1860, the California legislature established the California Geological Survey. What the legislature had in mind was to hire scientists to figure out where the valuable mineral resources were in California. And who best to do that job but the most prominent geologist in the country, a Yale professor named Josiah Whitney. Whitney hired as his chief field assistant a botanist, a man named William Brewer. Brewer was a teacher in upstate New York, and he was struck by a family tragedy. His wife and his infant daughter died in an epidemic. So he's looking to get away from it all for a few years. So he applied to become a member of Whitney's survey, and he was hired sight unseen on the basis of his good recommendations. Well, it wasn't long before they had heard from the legislature that the survey ought to head out to Mount Diablo because there was a lot of mining going on. Whitney did not take the directive from the legislature very well. He shot back, "This is a scientific expedition, not a prospecting party." But they went. They set up camp in Mitchell Canyon, and they quickly ascertained that all the mining on Mount Diablo, well, it really wasn't something to write home about. People were just scraping by. Brewer writes back to his brother Edgar, "Well, we're going to stay here on Mount Diablo for a while because Professor Whitney thinks the geology of Mount Diablo is the key to understanding the geology of the Coast Range." And they stayed. They climbed Mount Diablo, and Brewer was looking at the rocks. And although he was a botanist, he knew quite a bit about geology. He picked it up from his buddies on the survey, and there was one thing that puzzled him. He was pretty certain that Mount Diablo wasn't a volcano, but he saw rocks that looked like volcanic rocks. And he scratched his head and he said, "Well, I guess I know how Mount Diablo got its name. Some of these rocks look like they've been roasted by the devil." They stayed on Mount Diablo and around the Bay Area way too long to suit the legislature. They wanted to know why the survey was spending so much time looking at fossils and old bones and rocks and not figuring out where the really good mineral resources were. And that set off Whitney again. He shot back, "We've braved the perils of flood and field. We've avoided the friendly embrace of the grizzly bear. We've fallen into the jaws of the legislature." And they cut off his funds. And Brewer had to go back and patch things up. And this went on repeatedly over the 10 years of the survey. But for all its trouble, all its problems, the Geologic Survey was very important. First, Whitney did succeed. He did set the standard for scientific surveys. The California Geological Survey was very methodical. They were the first ones to use topographic lines on all of their maps. They used triangulation to accurately measure elevations and distances. After that, all scientific surveys had to use triangulation and topographic maps. It was a training ground for the next generation of scientists. They went on to various degrees of fame. William Brewer went on, well, the plants that he cataloged and mapped during the Geologic Survey became quite important. Grad students at the University of California spent decades cataloging those plants, and he discovered several new ones, including the Brewer's rock crest found on Mount Diablo and the Mount Diablo buckwheat. He took part in the famous Harriman expedition with John Muir up to Alaska, and he eventually became a professor at Yale. But the one that became the most famous was the youngest one on the expedition, a man named Clarence King. Now, he wasn't part of the original expedition. He was too young. He had just graduated college early. He was just about 20. He'd come from a very influential Rhode Island family. And he read a report about Mount Shasta, and he became fascinated with California. He wanted to get out there and climb Mount Shasta. So he took a covered wagon west, landed in Sacramento, and prepared to get on a steamboat to San Francisco. And he got on the steamboat, and he said, "Oh, look at these guys." They were miners, and they all had their 6 guns and their grubby clothes and their hats. And there's one guy that kind of catches his eye. And Clarence King thinks to himself, "That's got to be William Brewer." So he walks over and he strikes up a conversation, and sure enough, it's William Brewer, headed back to San Francisco from one of his little forays to Sacramento to patch things up with the legislature. And they start talking, and Clarence King finagles his way onto the Geologic Survey as an unpaid assistant geologist. You can read that as intern. And it's all interns. He got all the hard jobs. Clarence King got to climb the difficult peaks and risk his life several times. He wanted to climb everything, and they had to kind of put the kibosh on that. But he had boundless enthusiasm. Everybody loved him. And after the Geologic Survey, he wrote about his adventures mountaineering in the Sierra Nevada. Kevin Starr, who was the state historian, ranked mountaineering in the Sierra Nevada as one of the great works of California literature in the 19th century, just a cut below Mark Twain's works. Anyway, soon after the Geologic Survey, Clarence King, then aged 25, went to Congress. And he managed to extract money out of Congress for a 40th parallel survey from the California-Nevada border east over the Rocky Mountains. Older scientists have been trying to do that for years, and how Clarence King managed to convince Congress shows his powers of persuasion. Anyway, he got his money. He hired the top scientists of the day. He got William Brewer to come back. He had some scientists come over from Europe because there were no equivalents in the United States. And he undertook his survey, and he did it along the lines that he had learned from Whitney. It was a great scientific survey. Well, he finished his survey, and he headed back to Washington, and he was appointed the first head of the U.S. Geologic Survey. That would have been still in his 20s. And he made sure the U.S. Geologic Survey, well, its primary objective was science, which holds through to this day. He kept it out of politics, and to this day it has that same reputation that Clarence King set for doing good science, no matter what the cost, and he had learned that from Whitney. But they did have one dicey moment, because not long after the USGS had been formed and the 40th Parallel Survey had gone into the history books, diamonds were discovered in Wyoming and Montana. There were some prospectors from Kentucky. They claimed to have discovered a big diamond mine, and they brought back samples, and they got everybody and his uncle to invest in their diamond mine. And everybody did it. The Tiffany saw the gems, and they invested, and most of the wealthy people, millions and millions of dollars. And Clarence King hears about this, and he says, oh, gee, that doesn't make us look good. We went right through there with the 40th Parallel Survey, and we didn't see anything. And these Kentuckians were kind of secretive about where the mine was, but Clarence King had figured it out. He went there, and he starts looking at the rocks. And he starts picking up all sorts of gemstones. And the first day he says, there might be something to this. The second day he notices that it looks like they've been dug in little holes with a stick and placed in sandstone. And he says, this mine's been salted. And he went back to the East Coast and made the newspapers. He exposed the great diamond fraud. And people lost money, but a lot more money was saved that would have been invested. And one of the New York newspapers ran a headline, "The country has been saved by God and Clarence King." And that was his real claim to fame, exposing the great diamond fraud. Well, he was head of the USGS for just a couple of years, and then he resigned, and he became the most sought-after lunchtime speaker for all the influential men's clubs in New York. And he was a great storyteller. Everybody wanted him to come and speak and to join. He was a real rock star. His best friend was John Hay, who had been Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary and later went on to be Secretary of State. And John Hay wrote that Clarence King was the best and the brightest of his generation. So you figure things couldn't get any better, and that when he was engaged to be married, that would have made all the newspaper headlines. Except the woman he was engaged to be married to was an ex-slave from Georgia, a woman named Ada Copeland. Now, how these two met somewhere in Brooklyn, well, it's still a mystery. She had made her way up from Georgia after the Civil War. She had taught herself to read. She'd made her way up to New York, and she was working as a live-in maid. Somehow they met in Brooklyn. Their eyes met, and it was love at first sight. But Clarence King had a problem, because even though interracial marriage wasn't illegal in New York, it was frowned upon by both races. So he had to think fast, because Ada wouldn't have wanted any long-term relationship. So he looks at Ada and he says, "I'm black." Well, that was hard, because he was blonde hair and blue eyes. And she's looking at him and he says, "Well, my great-great-grandfather was from the West Indies, so I'm 1/8 black." And that's all it took back then to be considered black. He told her his name was James Todd, and he was a Pullman porter. Well, they got married secretly, James Todd and Ada Copeland. They settled down in Brooklyn. They raised 5 children. And every day he'd get up, he'd put on his Pullman porter's suit from their apartment in Brooklyn, take his lunch pail, walk to the Brooklyn Bridge. He'd find a place to hide out, change into his tuxedo, and walk across the bridge. He had some bachelor digs in Manhattan. And at lunchtime, he'd hobnob with the wealthiest people in the country and give his talks and his speeches. He had dinner with presidents and was sought after as a mining consultant. And he managed to pull this off all these years. But over the years, the psychological burden grew and the financial burden. He wasn't a wealthy man. He knew that if he came out of the closet, so to speak, he'd lose all his dinner engagements, his luncheon engagements, and his mining consulting work, and he'd have no way to support his family. So he had to keep quiet. Anyway, he eventually became ill. He got tuberculosis. He didn't have enough money to treat it. And finally, as a last resort, he headed out to Arizona. And he continued to get worse, and on his deathbed, he wrote a letter to Ada Copeland confessing all, telling her that he was Clarence King, the famous geologist. So, geologists weren't always the dull group that you think of now. They used to get in quite a bit of trouble, whether it be Josiah Whitney, William Brewer, or Clarence King.